There we go.
Yay!
I don't know if anybody, I don't think anybody's on there yet, but hopefully they got my message. Sure, yeah.
Oh, you want to catch the slides too, though?
Yeah.
So,
I don't know. I might be able to zoom in a little, but I'm just gonna. Oh, we got.
There's no microphone.
On the audio.
Oh, that's a great question too. We don't have audio.
So I am plugged in at the
Slide that desk a lot closer.
Founded.
Okay.
Like right.
Yeah, the North Shore. It's so annoying.
Yeah. What?
So I've got
Oh, yeah, that's Jessica. I ran into her and I was like,
So I want to see what tell me about this. Actually, so we're not going to
no, trying to get the audio. Our
yeah, because I have a new bag.
So I'm not the people from work.
That's what I had before.
Generating facilities.
your audio.
There's a lot of
I know, but she's got her screen up.
Are we playing music? Or are we? Yeah. Oh, that's a good sign. All right. Tell me when you're ready and we'll get started. Good. Hi back. Just talking about okay.
All right. Are you gonna come to a three-part?
Aaron will be good, but I have a meeting, so yeah.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
So where are you going to sit so you're not blocking?
Well, I can be right here.
Okay, great.
And then that way, if anybody has questions at the
Perfect.
end, I can read them off.
I'm not surprised. All right. Welcome, everybody. Let's get started. Please take your seats. We have coffee and cookies in the back to go along with whatever may or may not appropriate you for lunch. But if not, just have some coffee and cookies. Welcome. Happy Monday. We had a bit of a technical difficulty this morning, so we apologize for the little bit of a last-minute challenge with the IT setup. So for those who are online, we know we have an online audience. Welcome. We're very glad to have you. We're hoping the audio is good and that we can take questions from you later on in the program. So today I'm Ellen Anderson. I'm the director of the Energy Transition Lab at the Institute on the Environment. And we are really delighted today to have Professor Podkey with us. Professor Podkey is a professor at Macalester College, but she's also a visiting Institute on the Environment scholar. And she's a professor of environmental studies at Macalester, and her focus areas include energy and climate policy, citizen science, community-based research methodologies, and sustainable development initiatives, which covers a lot of turf. And welcome, Senator. Come on in. We're just starting. And she is currently the principal investigator on a multi-year National Science Foundation study on mining futures. And we were having a conversation about the need for metals in our clean energy transition that we're going through and how it raises two very interesting issues together into one big environment and economic set of questions. And so we're very excited that Dr. Podkey is digging into these and is here today to share her great ideas and knowledge. So welcome.
It's inevitable. I think when you give talks on mining, you end up using all kinds of metaphors like digging. It just happens. So I'd love that you started off with that. Good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for making time on what I'm sure is a really busy Monday after the Thanksgiving holiday when you have many things to catch up on. I feel like this is my classroom because nobody wants to sit in the front two rows, but I'll try to project so that you can hear me on the back there. So as Alan said, I'm in an environmental studies department, but I come out of a training in political science, and I study how political decisions are made over environmental values, conflicting environmental values in society. In particular, I'm interested in how we design infrastructure, and I've studied a whole bunch of different kinds of technical systems, hydroelectric dams, wind energy, solar energy, and this project brings together my interest in water and energy and climate. I also, I don't think it was in my bio, I lead a group of scholars from the field of science and technology studies. And we have a network that's called STS Underground, which groups together scholars around the world who are interested in making sense of, understanding how we know the subterranean landscape and extraction issues. We had a recent meeting in Australia where we looked at coal mining. So I'm going to talk today about three related issues, I think, of interest to many of us. How we think about energy and climate justice, how we think about traditional environmental justice, and how we think about consumer justice, and how we might link up these three issues. So I'm going to start my presentation actually with the ubiquitous iPhone, which is in many of our pockets. How many of you bought a new one recently? Amazon just told me the new one is out today, or recently. So maybe some of you purchased a new one, and maybe some of you replaced a phone that you had previously. So this is audience participation time. What's in your phone? Just shout out. What do you think it's composed of? What's that?
A lot of garbage.
What else? Rare earths. Silicon. What else? What do you think most of it is actually? Glass, plastic. You know, if I don't have for you a map today, but if we were to map the trail of the components of your iPhone, it touches every single continent. It's a global traveler even before it gets to you. So on April 2017, my slides are not on class. Wait a second, I can grab. Okay, well, I'm going to go on and read you what's missing. So in Apple's 2017 Earth Day Pledge, they pledged to use 100% responsibly sourced, recycled, or renewable materials, and to ensure the equivalent amount was returned to the market. And when that pledge was made, a lot of people paused and said, well, how will they do that? Right? There isn't a path for that. And in the following year, they introduced, and I'm sorry that this is cut off. I'm not sure if there's a fix here. But I'll tell you that in the following year, the April 2018, we met Daisy. This is Daisy here, and she is a 30-foot-long robot that tears apart phones with 5 robotic arms. At full capacity, she will disassemble 200 iPhones an hour without the need for coffee breaks and all kinds of breaks. She can handle from the iPhone 5 to the iPhone 7, and will recover thousands of kilograms of aluminum, cobalt, copper in the circuit boards, and rare earth elements, as some of you mentioned. We can't find Daisy everywhere. She is in Austin and a few locations. And I want to share with you this video produced by Apple. Now, if you've ever tried to take apart your own phone, you'll realize how that was very disturbing. I'm sorry. I have a kind of screen here. You can only see it. Anyone that's again, need some help in trying to pull this over. I think we're going to be missing a 4 minutes. Okay, so the reason I shared that with you is that I want to talk today about what we think of traditional conventional mining and alternatives like urban mining. And Daisy is an example of maybe the future, which we describe as urban mining. We'll come to this later in my talk and define it and sort of explain it. But just for now, I want you to hold the number. Yeah, I'm just going to keep talking time. So I want you to hold a number in your head, which is 13. So the research suggests that it's 13 times cheaper to harvest metals from our consumer devices, from the metals that are already in the technosphere, things that are around us above ground, than it is to employ virgin mining of metals. And so I'm going to come back to that in a bit, but I wanted to start here. Okay, so I'll try to fill you in. There's our 13%.
Our IT guru is sick today, so I do apologize for the technical difficulties.
Okay, hopefully you can see it. So this graph might look familiar to you. It's from the IPCC report that came out recently that has been reported on widely in the media that's talking about the urgency of mitigating climate change. And this is actually from the executive summary, so it's a very simple stylized graph, but it shows you the sort of precipitous decline we need in emissions to get to net zero by 2055 or 2040. So I wanted to also share this with you. So when we think about the metals that we need for our green energy future and the consumer devices that we care a lot about, we often think that this is coming from very far off places, right? We think about places like this. This is Bolivia, a National Geographic photograph that describes or illustrates lithium mines in the Atacama Desert. And we often think about places like this. This is lanthanum mining in China. And conventional wisdom is that most of our metals, and particularly precious metals and rare earth metals, are coming from China, right? And that is true. I think the important parts you can see of this, this is 2014, you can see this is 1970, you can see how much of the volume of the metals that are used in industry around the world come from China. So when we talk about climate change solutions, solutions like this, we are talking about technologies that have a very heavy metals footprint. Someone mentioned rare earths. Rare earths in particular are really important to these range of technologies. They have unique magnetic and catalytic and luminescent properties that are very hard to substitute with other kinds of metals. Now, while we recognize how important these solutions are, I also want to note that there are campaigns moving us towards 100% renewable energy. This is the Sierra Club's campaign. This is a news story about Costa Rica having generated renewable energy for 300 days last year. The City of London's pledge to zero carbon, and Minneapolis very recently became the 65th city to adopt 100% renewables. And then very recently, California's mandate that came out in September. So the reason I want to draw our attention to this is I really want us to think about what would it mean to get to 100% as a nation? And what does that look like? How would our lives change? Would our landscapes change? Who would bear the burden of that 100%? And what's discussed as the electrification of everything. So here's a graphic for us to think about. This is looking at 100% renewable energy and the energy mix. And I want to just focus on wind turbines for a minute. Some of you in the audience here I know are very familiar with them. And so based on the data that I've seen, getting to 100% renewable energy, if we just look at the percentage of wind energy that would be contributed, that is equivalent to about 250,000 large scale onshore wind turbines, 5 times as much as we have today. And so it's a pretty enormous scaling challenge that we have in front of us. So I've been interested in these questions, and I was also interested in the metals footprint, which drew me to the World, so this is my source here that says World Bank 2018. Just this past year, the World Bank came out with a report, its first report, looking at, the title is The Growing Role of Minerals and Metals for a Low Carbon Future. And what they did is model 3 different scenarios. They modeled the blue is 2%, so holding 2 degrees, holding to 2 degrees warming. The blue is green is 4 degrees, and the red is 6 degrees. So basically, the point being made is if we are to honor the Paris Treaty, then we will have an enormous increase in demand for metals, and some metals even more than others. You can see in here, indium is one where at that 2 degree scenario is a rather staggering new metals supply that we need. So this project for me actually was born one night in January of 2014 when I was at the River Center in downtown St. Paul for the PolyNet hearing, and maybe some of you were there as well. It was a very cold night. It was minus 10 degrees, and there were still, I think, 2,500 people who came out to this hearing. I was particularly taken by a comment made by State Representative Tom Ricavina. And when he took the mic, essentially scolded mining opponents to deposit their cell phones and their iPads at the door if they didn't support PolyNet. And in a kind of orchestrated action, as he was saying that, men, mostly men in hard hats, stood up around the perimeter of the room, and they shook giant paper bags, inviting people to deposit their devices. And it was a very theatrical performance, and it really caught my attention, as did this quote. And I'm going to read it to you because some of it's cut off. All these little gadgets that you have are made from minerals. You can export your pollution to China, or you can have slave labor in Africa. But right here, you can have good union mining jobs in the state of Minnesota. So that began this, and for me now, a multi-year project of trying to trace what does responsible mining mean? How does what we do here in Minnesota relate to mining projects around the world? And are there alternatives? And I want to contrast that.
I was just going to note the online folks need you in full soccer coach mode.
No. Okay. So the other quote I wanted to share with you came from another hearing in the city of Duluth a couple years later, where a local citizen took the mic and said, in contrast to the statement before, you, and they were talking to the regulators on the stage, you owe us more than a Faustian choice between economic stagnation and a kind of pollution that lasts 500 years. So I want to use those two quotes to frame my comments today. So how do we solve the green tech metals crisis? I'm going to introduce sort of three big ideas for us to think of today. The first is that we could repatriate metals and mining back to the United States. And I'll tell you a little bit of when we used to be a metals capital. So we could repatriate, but we could also consider recycling. And lastly, today I'm going to talk about the politics of repay. And all of these, again, are intended to connect climate, environmental, and consumer justice. So I'm not sure if many of you saw that around this time last year, President Trump signed an executive order, and the number is up there on my slide. The title of the executive order was A Federal Strategy to Ensure Secure and Reliable Supplies of Critical Minerals. And it's, as you can imagine, multi-pages long. But I wanted to highlight section 3, which talks about policy. And the policy here is that we need to source new precious and rare earth metals, what they call critical minerals. It's a kind of big umbrella category. That we need to think about the supply chain all the way from exploration through processing and reprocessing. That we need to ensure that our miners have the most reliable information, whether that's geologic or economic, about how these commodities platforms. And then lastly, this was really interesting, to streamline or in other words, fast track the permitting process so that these mines can be opened up as quickly as possible. So this came out last year. Part of this executive order asked the Department of Interior to identify locations, exploration locations, where we could produce metals in the near future. And so this is what we've been doing in my research lab, is tracking some of these new sites. I actually want to go back in time a little bit. This is the Molycorp facility. This is California. Las Vegas is here. So many don't realize that the United States provided the world rare earth metals until just about the 1980s. This site was first developed in the 1950s, and production at Mountain Pass continued for about 40 years until in 1984, it was found that there was some really significant leaks going on in this facility. If you remember, the 1980s is also the period of really aggressive toxics legislation in the United States. And as our environmental standards grew, it became less and less possible for a place like Mountain Pass to operate. So it was shut down. In the last 10 years, there have been periods where it has opened up again and shut down again. And sort of in a grand irony right now, this facility was actually bought by the Chinese. And so what was America's first rare earth mine is now China's, one of China's many rare earth mines. There are a few projects that are kind of far along, though, when we think about repatriating mining to the United States. And this is Wyoming, and this is the rare elements site. This is not far from Devil's Tower, if you're familiar with this landscape. And this is a site that has actually experienced a lot of contestation because it's adjacent to many tribal lands and also on public lands. And this is where one company called Rare Element Resources has actually acquired a permit, but has mothballed their project because they cannot get financing for it. This is another example of, this is probably the one closest to actualization. Eucor is in Alaska. This is Prince of Wales Island here. This is where the facility will be. This is a project that has benefited greatly from the Trump administration's pledge to support new mining. The state legislature of Alaska also provided really significant financial resources to get this site up and going. That said, it's probably at least 10 years before they're taking metals from the earth and processing in Alaska. And they have opened a new processing facility, but they're actually taking ore from China and processing here in Alaska. And then lastly, just a picture of the Boundary Waters to remind us about two ongoing controversies about mining, including some rare earths here in Minnesota. So one of the things my research group has been doing is writing up case studies of projects that are in the permitting. Up there on the top is the Alaska one, that are have been identified as potential new mines for green technology minerals. And this slide here talks about some of the metals that would be mined, who's developing them, and their status in the far right-hand side. you'll notice many of them are stalled. And when I refer to complete, right, this is a lithium mine, which many of you know is quite different than other kinds of underground or open pit mining, is the only one on this list that's actually operational. So I share this all with you because if you look across the examples of where new mining projects are being investigated in the United States, despite claims of urgency from the federal government and expedited review by agencies, it's actually been exceedingly difficult to open a new mine in the US, particularly for precious and rare earth metals. And even in the most mining friendliest parts of the country, like in Wyoming, it's that fact that these mines need immense capital investment, which they're largely relying on multinational mining companies to provide, volatile commodity prices globally, and in many cases, very limited support from host communities to actually open these mines. Right, so if one of the solutions to acquiring the metals we need for climate solutions is repatriating mines, it's not happening, and it's not happening fast enough, given the urgency that we need metals for this new green economy. So I'm going to turn to recycling. So less than 1% of rare earths are recycled globally, and that statistic is even less in the United States. And so I want us to think about alternatives. If repatriating isn't working, can recycling work as an alternative? When I think about what it means to mine responsibly, my mind usually goes to open pit mines. I don't think about recycling metals that are among us in the technosphere. So the definition for urban mining that I'm going to use today, and that's the word that's missing there, is recycling materials from the technosphere. These are the buildings, the facilities, the devices that make up our lives. And often it's talked about as urban mining because of the tremendous population in the world that lives in cities. Right? If we could harvest the waste, the metals waste in our lives, we could offset some of the virgin mining that is projected around the world. Now, this is a term, I don't know, maybe just a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the term urban mining? So let's say maybe a third of us. It is not a common term in the United States. It is an extremely common term in the EU and in Japan. And I think Ellen mentioned that I'm a visiting scholar here at IME in the fall. I'm actually going to be leaving in a couple of weeks to do some sabbatical research travel, and I'll be spending my sabbatical in Japan and in the EU tracing this concept of urban mining, which is so ubiquitous in those countries, and trying to understand why it hasn't quite settled here in the US. And there are lots of reasons for that, I believe. But one of the things that we've been doing is tracing where urban mining exists. And there's a key here, which I'm afraid you can't see, but it codes different kinds of urban mining enterprises. So some of these are research projects, some of them are businesses. There are art and design collectives as well. And what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to gather, is a kind of meta look at this field to see where it's taking hold, in what forms, and can this actually address our need for metals and for solutions. So I'm going to give you some snapshots of a few projects that I found very interesting. And the first comes from Japan. And the important part you see is the Olympic medal. So the Japanese will host the 2020 Olympics, and in a kind of grand gesture of environmentalism, they are producing all of the metals from urban mining. So there's a giant collection project in every prefecture where they're collecting devices of all kinds and harvesting the metals and using that to make the bronze, silver, and gold medals for the next Olympics. I'm very curious about how that will happen. It's a massive collection project to actualize. Another example for you is from Amsterdam. So Amsterdam is a site of a large EU-sponsored research collective that is actually prospecting the city of Amsterdam as a mine. And this is a quote from the research study. It says, Amsterdam is an urban mine. Amsterdam is tons of steel, copper, aluminum, gold in the high-rise buildings, in the cables, in the window frames. If you need metals, go prospecting in Amsterdam. And similar studies are underway in Paris and in other global cities. And this really caught my attention because it made me wonder, what if Minneapolis is the mine? And how would that recenter the kind of policies that we would put into place, the relationship we would have with our devices, and the responsibility we might feel for contributing metals to this new green economy. Another example comes from Sweden. Bjorn Wallstein leads a research group at Linköping University, and what they are after is what they call the hibernating infrastructure. So they have created heat maps and are trying to extract all of the metals that lie just below the subsurface. These are cables, these are rails that they believe they could harvest and repurpose. One more example for you is in the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. This is a company that's called the Urban Mining Corporation. And I just want to read to you the way they describe their work. Our cities are responsible for the vast majority of the worldwide consumption of materials. And they go on to say that compared to conventional mining, urban mining has higher ore grades, is located close by and above ground, and has many benefits to make it worth investigating. And so this is a company that finds this lucrative work to do. One more quick example for you is on the more playful side. This is of a jewelry company based in Brooklyn, one of my few US examples that upcycles components into jewelry. And if many of you maybe have bought these things where you can't quite tell where the metal is coming from. And in comparison, this is very conspicuous, right? You can imagine where this material came from, and it's really meant to make a statement about the future life of some of our components. So I'm going to actually try to conclude here so we can have time for conversation. I started off talking about DAISY, and I've been thinking a lot about DAISY. I've been thinking about what it means to shift our consciousness as consumers and really think about what recycling in the future might look like. And if we look out 10 or 20 years, which is the time frame that we're thinking about the green economy and the green energy economy, your recycling isn't going to be about those 3 bins that are in the back. And it's already not about that in many parts of the world, right, where we're thinking really beyond paper and plastic to all of these new elements that really could be fundamental for the high-tech lives that we want to lead. And maybe this is the solution, where you have a company like Apple who's investing in doing that recycling, and our part is just to send our devices, or maybe it looks something quite different. And with that, I want to turn to the third solution, which is repair and the right to repair. So there's a movement, maybe some of you are familiar with it in the US, to try to force companies through policy decisions to design our devices differently so that we can repair them. And also this producer take back part of the initiative, which means that those producers take back our devices of all sizes, including large appliances, and repurpose the waste. So these are thought of as fair repair legislation or right to repair legislation, and it is making its way through 20 states in the US, including in Hawaii. And there was a story just last week in the LA Times that I want to mention in a second. This is the organization repair.org, which helps to support these policy campaigns in many states. And you can go there and see some of the templates of legislation, some of the legislation that's been introduced in many states. So this is the headline from the LA Times from just, I think it was last week, was how Apple and other manufacturers attack your right to repair their products. And it talked about the corporations that are standing in the way of right to repair legislation. And it may not surprise you that Apple is one of them, as is John Deere. Right? And that's an interesting story. And one of the reasons that right to repair legislation is has a very strong movement among farmers in Nebraska. And part of that is John Deere's opposition to right to repair. And then I just saw recently Amazon has also started to oppose the right to repair legislation in the sense that they are limiting our opportunity to buy refurbished devices through Amazon. So these are devices that have been repaired essentially and are available on the marketplace. So repair.org has this call out to us as Minnesotans. Again, I'm going to read it to you. It says, it's time to speak out for your right to repair, that a fair repair legislation was introduced in the Minnesota Senate. There was actually a hearing in earlier January of this year. The Senate committee took it up. Right now, there isn't a single state that has actually passed right to repair legislation. And so this is an opportunity here and elsewhere to really think broadly about where metals come from and the supply and the demand for metals in the economy. So one of the things that we've been doing in my lab is hosting Fairphone workshops. And I'm going to pass around, this is the guide that we use. Fairphone is a Netherlands-based company that makes a phone that works, but isn't necessarily sexy. It's a little clunky. It's transparent. You can see all the parts. It's imminently hackable. And the point is you buy one and you can continuously repair it. And so I find this company fascinating. I tried to buy one and they're very expensive. But I wanted to use it essentially as a prop. And so I'm going to see if I can get an older model that I can afford. But part of what they do is sponsor these workshops. And so we posted several of these at McAllister. These are pictures of students. I really enjoyed seeing all of my faculty colleagues who came to them. And we essentially took apart phones for an afternoon and really got to understand their innards and think about what is there, what can be recycled, what happens to these when they're done. And I think it was enlightening for all of us to really take seriously what our how we use metals in our lives and what part of our responsibility is to the future. And so let me end here much where we started, and I apologize you can't read the entire slide. I'm going to read it to you. This is a statement by Rick Nolan, U.S. Congressman, and the title of the statement is, "It's time for opponents of mining to take responsibility for their high-tech lifestyles." And I think I have enough time to read parts of this to you, especially the parts that I'm missing. The truth is, we need strategic minerals in order to address climate change, one of the greatest and most profound challenges of our generation. Many of the tools in the battle against climate change, windmills, hybrid cars, energy-efficient buildings, are created from minerals like copper, nickel, and steel. Every new electric car contains, on average, 165 pounds of copper, 9 pounds of nickel, 240 pounds of nickel-based aluminum. We can talk more about that statistic. Electric cars are really interesting in terms of the conventional versus the metal footprint there. So hold that thought. But every new wind turbine generating electricity to recharge these vehicles contains on average nearly 200 tons of steel and approximately 4 tons of copper. By manufacturing these products with American mined strategic minerals, so this is the repatriation solution, we can reduce our carbon footprint, keep our air and water clean, and fight back against the effects of climate change that threaten our entire world. In this sense, mining and environmental interests aren't at odds with one another. In fact, they're two passionate causes with one mutually beneficial goal, a green economy. And it ends with saying that out here in Minnesota, we call that a win-win. These kinds of quotes are routinely used in debates about mining. Right? Is this a false bargain? Does having new mines in Minnesota displace mines in Mongolia? Now, there's a lot that we could unpack in this quote. But I wanted to end here because I think, especially as someone who identifies as a clean energy advocate, as a climate activist, I find myself in a really difficult position where I feel deeply implicated in the choices that we make for our clean energy future and the possibility that we are creating new industrial sacrifice zones in this country and other parts of the world in order to secure the metals that we need for this future. And clearly we need to come up with something different. And then when you add to that, even if we wanted to repatriate mining, we see the struggles across the country in doing so. Our urgent interest in new climate change solutions does not temporally map on to our desire to mine them from the underground. And so given that challenge, what are our alternatives? Can we look to things like urban mining as an alternative? And with that, biggest challenge will be scale. How can we scale up those collection efforts rapidly in order for those to be supplies of new metals? But then also, I didn't want to leave out the consumer justice and the repair and the right to repair piece of this, because I really do think it's a three-legged stool. And to only address one issue means to disregard some of the important other issues. So I'm going to end with just a thank you slide, which isn't doing its work. I wanted to acknowledge the support I've had, particularly from the National Science Foundation that has funded this research over the last 3 years, and to a great cadre. I've had 6 students working with me for the last 3 years on this project as well. Some of them are pictured there. But with that, thank you for your time, and I would welcome your comments and your questions. Oh.
And please speak loudly because of our, yes. So,
and I'll try to paraphrase your question back for the online folks. Yes.
With respect to where urban mining is occurring, at what level are they aggregating or disaggregating flow? In other words, if you separate out copper wire, for example, that would go separately into a bin versus, say, just grinding everything, and making essentially a mixed ore out of it. Does it tend to be more segregation, or is it more composite types of materials?
Yes. So the question was about what level of aggregation or disaggregation is going on in the urban mining industry today. And this is a question I'm really interested in. And I think it depends on the industry and the business interests that are advocating for it, right? So the car companies are really interesting. And one of the initiatives I've been following is called the Responsible Copper Initiative, right? And it's a partnership between BMW, BMW based in Europe, and a Chilean mining company, right? And so they're focused in on copper in particular, because of the volume of copper needed for electric vehicles, right? And so there, it's really focused on that, on copper. But some of the other urban mining projects that we've been looking at are basically attached to large smelters, and different kinds of ore, comes in, it's smelted and it's separated, and that smelting process can be highly toxic. So in those contexts, right, urban mining may not be the best solution as it's being done. There's one very controversial project called the Solvay project in Western France that was purported to be sort of the first big urban mining initiative in France. It had a lot of government support. And then over time, a lot of the communities around there said, this is really toxic. We don't actually want this in our backyards. So it was another version of this similar problem. So I think it's really dependent on the way it's handled in each country. Now, the European Union, through its WEEE directive, its Waste and Electronics directive, has a really fascinating platform online which disaggregates metals and tries to do some statistical analysis on how much supply there is out there, where it's located, and how it would be recycled. So that's in part what I'm talking about, the difference in the sophistication across the EU compared with what is going on in the US. Is there a question over there?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the level at which innovation is being made in terms of the breakout of reduce waste production versus the recycling? Because in a way, if you are going to make policy decisions, in a way you have to look at a finer analysis of specifics of that. And I know that there's a myriad of different products, and you can just go down. It's a very difficult thing, but there must be some early studies or some general ideas of that. I mean, you can go back to the 80s, it's, you reduce first thing, recycling, compost, and there's that general stuff, but technically the analysis of how much energy, how much resources, how much water, all of those things go into it. I'm wondering if you can shed any light on it.
Yeah, thank you. This is, again, it's a really interesting facet, particularly about the shift to urban mining. What I realized, and as I've been doing this work for the last 3-4 years, is that urban mining is likely going to be the domain of waste management and not of mining companies. Right? Mining companies don't think about collection, right? They think about extraction. And so that shift to a collection-based metals economy means really learning from waste collection. And we're actually seeing that it's those waste collection firms that are moving into this space. They are colonizing urban mining way faster than mining companies are because they have the tools, the models to do it. And so that in itself is quite disruptive and is interesting to follow. And I don't know enough about your question historically, and even in our contemporary moment, all of the data we can look at there. But you know, as I said, that one thing that strikes me is that the way we do it now is unlikely the way we'll be doing it in the future. Just so one example, I don't know how many of you have tried to dispose of your electronics and found how challenging it is to do so. I actually have in my car right now this whole box full of the components from our phone dismantling workshops that I'm trying to figure out what to do with. Now, I usually take them to Tech Dump, which is not far from here off of Prior Avenue in St. Paul. And one of those times we got a tour of that facility to understand what happens to the things that we're trying to dispose of. Interestingly, and I apologize, this might seem like a bit of a tangent, but most of those kinds of facilities in the US, and Tech Dump is an example, are not really primarily about recycling. They're primarily about first jobs for incarcerated people who are coming back into the workforce. And so they're low-paying, entry-level jobs. It's not a high-tech operation, right? And they are getting some job training, and they're likely going to move on 6 months from now. So that is the model. That is very different than what we see in Europe and in Japan, where you can take a 6-week course in Belgium and be certified as an urban miner, and it is considered a high-tech career choice. Right? So there are all this sort of facets of what it needs to be in this industry, who's supporting it, the kinds of infrastructure that's being laid down, that I think is part of your question. And I've asked this myself, where is the break between what we think of as recycling and conventionally and what we think of as the future circular economy, which is really what we're talking about. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I actually coordinate for the state. I have questions on where you need to go someday. Anyway, let me know. But I was thinking about what for the waste in Minnesota here at our high point, we were bringing in 40 million pounds from households. A lot of that was the CRT. But have you looked at or looking at how much is coming in? In fact, the metals that you could get from that is not even touch what you're using for everything that we need. Or if that makes sense. A lot of it is the TVs and everything helps us out, but there's a lot that just gets thrown away. So, yeah, could you respond to some of those people who want mining? Well, it's all coming in, and you got to educate people to get more in it. So,
yeah,
you've got to find some of those.
Yeah, thank you. So for those online, hi. The question was had two parts. The first is of the materials that we collect now, how can they be repurposed in the economy? And the second question was, are there opportunities to do some of this work here in Minnesota? Or how do we address the mining?
Like the scale, right?
Yeah, is there, and do we have what we already have that we bring in?
Right.
25 states that have statutes. Just let that down. Whatever.
Yeah.
What's coming in right now?
Yeah.
In these states, we don't need to mine. We have enough
coming
in. And if we don't, if we have more education for people to not throw away their phones, if people catch all that, we need mining. Like, it can that be a response?
So that is a great question. And in my slide, I had the example of the federal executive order signed by President Trump. And there was one word in there about research on reprocessing. Right? So there are DOE labs, Ames Laboratory in particular, is investing in some of these questions. But my understanding is that research is pretty preliminary compared to what data we're seeing in other parts of the world. So I don't know an answer to that question, but I think it's a really important research question to understand. But I think part of the challenge is you have, as you're describing in our e-waste facilities, we have this stream of waste that's coming in. A lot of it are not necessarily the kind of metals that we need for green energy technology. Right? It's not necessarily cobalt or lanthanum or the kinds of elements that we consider extremely critical in stores. So I think that's part of the challenge. And part of that challenge is a lot of these devices are even larger if we think about in terms of energy platforms. Solar panels, wind turbines that have a 20 or 30-year lifespan we're just beginning to hit end of life on some of those installations. Right? So this is in part a question, maybe not for today, but setting up the economic system for 10 to 20 years from now, when those devices reach their end of life, and that we have a plan for how we will recycle and repurpose them. So I think the question has two parts. The first is, what do we have now, and what can we do with it, and at what scale, and can that offset some of our metal requirements? And then what do we know now that isn't coming in, that's not part of our collection stream today? So I don't know if there's any students in the room. I just want to make a pitch for a project that I would love for somebody to take up. I don't think I'm the person, but I've been hearing about wind energy facilities in western Minnesota and in South Dakota, some of the early ones that are, those turbines are being replaced. And we've seen them being dismantled. I would love to track the flow of those components and see where they're going, and to understand this question, because those are some of the components that we're talking about when we think about climate change solutions and the metal scarcity issue. Right? And so I'd love to be able to set up a system where we track those decommissioned, or there's a word for it. Do you know the word, John? When they're repowering. Yeah, the repowering initiatives, and track what's happening to the first metal stock that comes out of it.
I have brought up the solar recycling after we were at the solar conference recently about recycling. And then after the solar industry, Jeff started talking about that.
Yeah.
You mentioned this phrase responsible mining. I'm just curious if there's a standard definition for that.
Thank you. It's a great question. That's actually where I started this research project. The question was, is there a standard definition for responsible mining? And so there's a great deal of interpretive flexibility when it comes to the term responsible mining. And there are a number of industry associations that are based in Australia and in South America that are focused on creating an industry-wide definition of responsible mining. The challenge for me is responsible to whom? Right? Most often responsible mining from the mining industry's perspective is responsible to the host communities. And actually what it means is the social license to operate, which is a term that the mining industry has been using for 30 years, which basically means they have some social acceptance from the communities around the mines that pertains to labor conditions, to environmental damage, and to social benefits or economic benefit sharing. So in many cases, responsible mining still looks like that, right? Doing good by the people and the landscapes directly impacted by mining. I think the challenge for us in the 21st century is, what does responsible mining look like in Minnesota, where the stakeholders are not just the communities on the Iron Range, really extend out to the state, and when we're talking about federal lands, to the country. So it's a very different kind of definition we would have to operationalize than if you were Freeport-McMoran working in Papua New Guinea, and responsible mining to you is just about your open mine pit and the communities around it, if that makes sense. So I think we really do need to carefully think about responsible. And sometimes there's slippage between what sustainable mining is and responsible mining. And I don't think they're the same thing. Okay? And perhaps sustainable mining is responsible mining, but right now they're operating as two kind of different definitions.
A good pivot off that question about the sort of definition of responsible, having different definitions elsewhere in the world. You can also talk about how difficult it is to get mine operational in the United States. Is that similar elsewhere? Is it easier to get a mine to be operational elsewhere in the world? And so is that something we need to be considering in this conversation? You know, obviously that affects the repatriation portion, but we're seeing mines open up faster in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
What implications do that?
I'd love to tell you a very short story that I think is fascinating, and it's about Greenland. And so maybe some of you followed two sort of interesting things in Greenland. One is as the climate is changing, it's getting easier and easier to access minerals and metal wealth in Greenland. And on the other hand, Greenlanders desperately want their independence from Denmark. So this is an example of how quick or fast or slow things are going in other parts of the world. because Denmark is part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, right now the Greenlanders cannot mine for those metals because the rare earths are co-located with uranium and other radioactive minerals. And so part of their independence struggle from Denmark is about their own economic development as a nation, and they're tied together. Right? They can't mine unless they can secede from Denmark, and when they do, they see this vast wealth that they will exploit as soon as they can, because they see that as pivotal to their political future. Now that's a really interesting contrast to the kinds of mines that are trying to be developed here in the U.S. I mean, part of the reason the permitting is so challenging is because we have NEPA, we have NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires environmental impact statements, and we have a state level analogous system, and all of these slow down the permitting process. I mean, PolyMet is 10 years into its permitting process, right? And so that is part of it. Now, so many of us would feel like that's the appropriate amount of time that you would need to carefully turn over every rock and understand those impacts. But those don't exist around the world, and it does make mining go much faster. And also, you have corporations that have mined in the same regions, and it's very hard to see where the boundary is between the state and those mining corporations, particularly in parts of Latin America. And so it's very easy. I mean, there is no permitting process. It's very easy to extend the work of those companies. So just really quickly on that, one of the things that I found really important to distinguish between claim for responsible mining in Minnesota, like in the Bukovina and the Nolan quotes that I shared, is there is a sort of premise that repatriating mining to Minnesota means that we would have less human rights violations around the world. But that is a false premise. There is nothing that says that one mine here means one less mine in Mongolia or in Papua New Guinea, right? In fact, it's probably going to continue at a brisk pace in all of those places. And so I feel like we really need to challenge that claim of responsibility that suggests that mining here is displacing dangerous mining somewhere else. Yeah.
Two things. Steel is the most recycled material in the United States. So if you wanted to look at what kinds of processes to use, you could definitely look at steel as a great case argument. The electric arc furnace market has grown substantially, but what that requires is raw materials. So first, in your recycled conversation, I'm interested in knowing more about when you talk about recycled materials, you have to introduce the raw product. So where do you recommend you get that?
Yeah.
Second, here in our own backyard, the Metrodome was recycled basically. Almost all of the components of the Metrodome were recycled to the structure of the US Bank Stadium. Have you looked at that and explored that as you're looking at urban mining?
No, thank you for that. That's a great suggestion. Yes. So the question was first off about steel and the recycling of steel and how it's used in the economy. Another example locally is of US Bank. And your question was, as we think about recycling of metals, there's a part of that will be raw. You said raw products, and how do we think about where that comes from? And so I want to link back to a response I had earlier about waste collection versus mining companies. And this is what we're starting to see in some mining companies around the world, is this sort of vertical integration where they're looking at stocks and looking at them in a diversified way. Right? So it could be that some of their stock is coming from metal that's being ored in a facility, and some of it is being composed of things that they've collected. Right? And so those mining companies have the ability to do that in a very different way than if urban mining is the domain of trash companies and waste management companies. So that's part of what I'm trying to tease out. And then trying to look at examples of mining companies and there is there's a couple in Europe that are trending this way that started off as traditional mining companies that have now added urban mining as a portfolio of their work, and trying to understand how those stocks are commingling and how they're thinking about as they plan their mining investments. Okay, so I'm getting the hook here from Ellen. Thank you very much for coming and for your questions and comments. This is an ongoing project, and as I mentioned, I'm just beginning some of the international field work in 2019, and so I welcome your contacts, your leads, your questions as this unfolds.
Thank you so much.
I apologize that you could only see 2/3 of
I have to give a talk on mass area control, but welcome. Sharing the slide. Yeah. And so obviously, if we're going to be able to host this video, which we hope we can, we would love to have a few of them next slide.
So, you. It's going to be a giant file.
Oh, for Google or whoever you want.
Yeah, I
to
will
make it
send
better.
it over.
Yeah, that's fine. And Erin can.
I saw this. I know. I saw your email that went out to the world. But I know. But I thought this is, as somebody was saying, this is coming up.
So she'll share her slides.
So Holly and I met San Jose State together. Yeah. Just came out to the Festival Council. So